Good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the country you are joining us from. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders at the intersection of science and culture for meaningful and relevant programs about mental health. The Open Mind is proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my honor to introduce and welcome Dr. Joe Pierre, author of the critically acclaimed, and I might add very timely new book, False: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. False is an illuminating exploration of the psychology of false belief that lies at the root of science denialism, political polarization, and rampant belief in misinformation and disinformation. Drawing on decades of experience as a psychiatrist and clinical professor, Dr. Pierre invites readers to journey with him through the normal quirks of brain functioning that create the cognitive vulnerabilities to false belief that are innate within us and that can cause people to believe things that are false or misleading. Dr. Pierre is a health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCSF and has over 30 years of experience training people with psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, delusional disorder, and substance-induced psychosis, and also has academic experience in false beliefs. He has been featured in over 100 news articles and media interviews, appearing in the New York Times, The Guardian, Vanity Fair, Slate, CNN, BBC, NPR, and Vice News, and the award-winning documentary Behind the Curve. His blog, Psych Unseen, has attracted over 3 million views. We are also honored to have with us Dr. Alaina Burns, who will join Dr. Pierre in discussion. And from this point on, it will be Joe and Alaina. Alaina is an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA's Semel Institute and the Associate Director of Residency Education. She is the founder and medical director of the Thought Disorders Intensive Outpatient Program, which provides day treatment for individuals with psychosis. Alaina also serves as the medical director for the Adult Partial Hospitalization Program and is an inpatient psychiatrist at the UCLA Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital. On behalf of the Friends and the Resnick boards, I would like to thank both Joe and Alaina for taking the time from their busy schedules to join us today. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, we ask you please to type it into the Q&A located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. At last check, we had over 1,558 people, to be exact, registered for today's program. So we appreciate your patience and will try to get to as many questions as possible during the time allotted. Today's program is being recorded. It will be available for viewing tomorrow on our website, friendsofsemelinstitute.org. There you will find videos from past events, information about our Teen Advisory Council, our Research Scholar Program, and a calendar of upcoming Open Mind programs, including the 5th Annual Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held in person on Sunday, April 27th at UCLA. For all you high school students out there, the deadline for film submissions is March 27th. So please send us your films about mental health issues. And you can see our website for more information. Now, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Joe Pierre and Dr. Alaina Burns. Thank you so much. Anybody here? Oh, here we go.
Hi.
Hi, Alaina.
Can everybody see Joe?
Sorry, we just had it up and now I think it's loading. Give it a second.
We can hear you.
I know. We all just saw each other on the test, and now for some reason my video's being sluggish. Let me turn it off and on and see if that helps. How strange. Well, maybe we should start and then I can continue trying to see if I can get my video to work as we're speaking.
Okay, that sounds like a good plan.
Okay. Well, thank you, Vicky. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's a pleasure also to be talking to Joe Pierre. You were one of my mentors and teachers when I was a resident at UCLA, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And for those of you who have not yet read Joe's book, I highly recommend it. Very interesting for clinicians and non-clinicians. Joe, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I
Yeah,
mean,
do you want to try to figure out your Zoom?
yeah, it says background is still loading. So we'll
Okay.
just try to troubleshoot as we go, and I'll try to
Okay.
multitask.
Okay.
Um,
If you want to start off by telling us what prompted you to write the book?
sure. Well, as some of you know, I was at UCLA for many years. I went to medical school there and trained in psychiatric residency and worked primarily at the VA hospital next door, but also at UCLA for many years. And like you, Alaina, my main clinical interest was really psychotic disorders, or what we sometimes call thought disorders. And my favorite symptom, meaning the symptom that interested me the most, and when I work with psychotic patients, are delusions. Um, and so delusions we could simply define as fixed and false beliefs. What's funny about this, I think, is that in psychiatry, we focus so much on mental illness and psychopathology. We don't think a lot about false beliefs that occur outside of mental illness, which are very common. And in my academic work through the years, I've often been interested in this sort of what I call the gray area between clear-cut psychopathology and normality. And I think false beliefs, or what I sometimes call delusion-like beliefs, are just a great example of that sort of intersection between what seems to be a psychiatric symptom versus something similar to it that we experience in daily life.
Yeah, and I thought it might be helpful as well to kind of go through some examples of false beliefs that we talk about in the psychiatry world before kind of talking about the type of false beliefs that you're referring to, which are a little bit different. And I can go over a couple kinds of false beliefs that we talk about, some of which we've all experienced. One type of false belief that's very common is something that we call a cognitive distortion, which is an unhelpful or inaccurate thought pattern. And they happen because we all experience the world differently and we interpret events based on how well or how poorly things have turned out for us in the past. So for example, if I'm walking down the street and I pass a friend and she doesn't say hello to me, if I'm feeling down and lonely, I might think she's ignoring me because she thinks I'm boring and doesn't want to spend time with me. Whereas if I'm feeling really happy and confident, I might assume that she doesn't say hello because she was distracted on her phone and just didn't see me. So both of these thoughts about my friend are understandable, but only one of them is true. So we kind of talk about what we call cognitive distortions. Frequently in psychiatry, they're very common for people who don't suffer from mental illness. Another kind of false belief that you mentioned, Joe, is a delusion. And as you said, a delusion is generally defined as a fixed false belief that doesn't change even when we're given evidence against it. And people can develop delusional beliefs as a result of a psychiatric illness like schizophrenia. And so people with schizophrenia often interpret events in very negative and personalized ways so that they come to believe things that aren't true. So some of my patients with schizophrenia believe that they're being monitored by the CIA or the FBI, or that a microchip has been implanted in their brain and is controlling their actions. And a third type of false belief is what you have called a delusion-like belief. And I know you've written about delusion-like beliefs, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that looks like or what that is.
Sure. Well, in psychiatry, we have this manual that sometimes people call the Bible of psychiatry, right? The DSM. And then the DSM, there are these definitions of different mental disorders, and there's a glossary that talks about definitions of symptoms. But what we don't really have are definitions for what I'm talking about, delusion-like beliefs. And so that is sort of a term that's used primarily in psychology, in the psychology research, to talk about this sort of wide range of different beliefs that might, on the surface, seem to be delusional, might bear some resemblance to it. But then when you look more closely, you might decide that they're not, in fact, delusional because maybe they don't rise to that level of delusionality or that intensity. In fact, psychologists, I think, for many years, when they study delusions, have more than psychiatrists talked about a sort of continuum. And so, one way to think about delusions is to think about them in terms of cognitive dimensions. And that could include things like the degree of conviction one has about a belief, but also other dimensions like the degree of preoccupation that one has. And so if you quantify those beliefs, there might be certain ones that rise to this level of full delusionality, and there might be a lot more that don't quite rise to that level. And that's really what I've been interested in my academic work in recent years. Kind of got on this originally by developing an interest in conspiracy theories when I heard that there's people, and many hundreds, if not thousands of people who believe that the earth is flat. So that's a great example of something that on the surface sounds like maybe it's a delusion, but on closer examination for a variety of different reasons, I don't think we should consider that a delusion.
Could you go into that a little bit more? Because you write a lot about that in your book, and it's really interesting. And I know you've worked as an expert witness in some of these cases. To what extent are people, how do you distinguish between a delusion and a delusion-like belief? And to what extent are people responsible for kind of looking for the correct information on their own? I think it's a really tricky area.
Yeah, and I think it's in part tricky because, as I said, there aren't always well-defined, there aren't always good definitions for these terms that we're using. And frankly, it actually can be quite confusing. So, for example, if you look at the history of delusions in psychiatry, we used to use this concept called bizarre, to have a bizarre delusion. And that used to be one of the diagnostic criteria for something called delusional disorder, that delusions would be non-bizarre. And what that was supposed to mean, bizarre, was that whether or not something's even possible. And what they did many decades ago at this point was they did studies where they wrote up case vignettes and they gave them to seasoned clinicians and they asked the clinicians to say, is this bizarre or not? And what they found is they couldn't really get seasoned clinicians to agree on what was possible in the universe or not, right? So, for example, if I had a belief that God was talking to me and telling me what to do from minute to minute, there might be very well a lot of people who might say, well, that's possible. And there might be other people who say, well, no, I don't think that's possible at all. Um, so yeah, so it's confusing. And even in the DSM, the manual talks about the idea of an overvalued idea and how that can be difficult to separate from delusions. So in my clinical work, I kind of rely on some other ways of distinguishing these things. In the clinical work that we do, when we treat patients with psychosis and delusions, for example, we're generally speaking, talking about people who have beliefs that are about themselves in some way. And if you ask them, why do you believe this? What's the rationale? Oftentimes the rationale is some internal subjective experience. So I often talk about this idea of that the rationale is based on faith and subjectivity. It's based on faith of this internal experience. So if I hear a voice telling me that I'm, let's say, the second coming of Christ, well, that voice is real to me, and that's why I believe it. When we're talking about delusion-like beliefs, whether it's conspiracy theories or a whole host of other things, oftentimes we're not talking about beliefs about oneself. So conspiracy theories are typically about world events, things that are happening in the world, and not what I call self-referential. Those beliefs are often not about oneself. And they're also not based on subjective experience per se. They're often based on something like, well, I found this information on the internet and it told me that, that there was not a lone gunman and that's not why JFK died. So I think those two things, what is the belief really about and what is the rationale? Why does someone believe it can help guide us? Because the concept of delusions wasn't really designed to be to apply to beliefs that somebody has because somebody told them XYZ and they happen to
Mhm.
think that it was true.
Yeah, I'm thinking an example I have from my clinical work is a patient who believes that the Bible was written about him or to him in particular is different from feeling like the Bible is relevant to your life in some way. Because the first one is personalized, whereas the second one is more generalized. I think that's a really interesting point. Another thing I wanted to mention in talking about delusions, which is something I've been really interested in, is how technological advances have made the distinction between delusional beliefs and non-delusional beliefs much more hazy. And you mentioned this when you were talking about giving psychiatrists a list of things and what is possible and what isn't possible, and people really can't agree. And I've noticed that the things that people worry about now are oftentimes they may have seemed unbelievable 10 years ago, but they're very possible now. And some examples are, feeling like your cell phone is listening to you, which is that a delusional belief or is that reality based? Because if you have Siri enabled on your phone, then your phone is listening to you. Or people feeling like they're being personally fed certain videos through YouTube. Well, you are being fed personalized videos through YouTube and other social media platforms. So it's really difficult to reassure patients that things that they're believing aren't true when things are moving at such a rapid pace.
Yeah, and this goes back to what I said about sort of quantifying or thinking about beliefs on a continuum. Part of the concept of delusion is, as I just said, doesn't typically apply to beliefs you have because somebody told you, this is true. Well, another related but sort of murky area in psychiatry is the concept of shared delusion. For centuries, we've recognized that occasionally people share delusional beliefs, but that's usually described as someone who has a delusion that then convinces someone else that this is true. And classically, that might occur just between two people or maybe three people. So there's this question now of whether or not that could apply to one person who has a delusional belief that then gets hundreds of people to agree with them. And so I think this concept of shareability is really key. And that's why I like to talk about self-referentiality,
Mhm.
because as I often say, there may be many, many people on the planet who believe that there might indeed or will indeed be a second coming of Christ, right? The idea of
Mhm.
a Messiah. So it would be easy for me to find somebody who had that belief. It would be easy for me to find somebody who believed that UFOs were flying around in the air and abducting people. But if I told you that I was the Messiah, or if I told you that I was abducted by UFOs and they, did a brain transplant or something like that, that's where it's going to be much more hard for me to get people to share that belief. But as you're suggesting, the real challenge in the modern world is now there's this thing called the internet. And I can log on to some website or do a post about being the Messiah. And, who knows? I might find people who believe that I am, or I might find someone across the country or across the world who says, wow, that's so cool because I'm the Messiah too, right? And then, okay, well, let's start, a friendship there or start a club. So
Yeah.
yeah, we now have this ability to kind of poll the entire planet to find people who might agree with us. And some of them might genuinely agree, and others might be just shining us on for fun, kind of trolling us. It looks like we were going to maybe try for me to log on and log off again to see if I can rescue my video.
Sure.
Um, so apologies, everyone. This is very strange, but I'm going to try to log off and then log right back on. Give
We
me
will.
a second. I'm sure Alaina can tell you a great story in the meantime. No pressure.
I'll just jump back on while Joe is trying to restart his internet. And Alaina, maybe while we're waiting, could you share a little bit about your work? Uh, that you run a psychosis clinic and a day treatment program at the resident
Yeah.
hospital.
Yeah, so I run a day treatment program for people with thought disorders, usually people with schizophrenia or with other psychotic disorders, but mostly with schizophrenia. And it's a program that focuses on group therapy and using cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a form of talk therapy that challenges beliefs and thoughts. We use this therapy modality to work with people with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders to help them meet their goals and live the kind of lives that they want to be living. And so medication is usually a part of the program, but not everybody who's in the program wants to take medication. So we really work with people to challenge their beliefs and to start thinking healthier and more productive thoughts. And so I've spent the past, 10 years or so really talking to people who have delusional beliefs, and getting a sense of what that feels like.
I'm so happy to know about this program, as I'm sure some of our listeners are, because we're often asked about programs that aren't, he's back.
There it is.
Yes, Joe.
Hey,
Great
sorry
to
about that,
see
everyone.
you.
Technical difficulties.
All right,
Hello.
I'm going to jump off and let the two of you continue.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was going to ask Joe, one thing that I think about a lot, and you address this in your book, and you were just kind of talking about it, is that there's this sense, and I definitely have this sense that people are more prone than ever to belief in conspiracy theories or to knowingly disseminate false information. And in your book, you talk about how this propensity to do that has always existed, although the effects are probably more consequential today than they have been in the past. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, I was a child of the 70s, and certainly from my perspective, it seems like conspiracy theories are much more common in terms of how many people believe them. But there have been some researchers, most notably Joe Yasinski, who's a political scientist in Florida. He's done some research where he's looked at, for example, the New York Times op-eds going back a century and trying to quantify conspiracy theory belief in that way. And his research and that of his colleagues has really shown there hasn't been a very clear net change in conspiracy theory belief. But there's a caveat to that because it's not really true that the degree of conspiracy theory belief has been constant for a century. There have indeed be these ebbs and flows. So there is actually some evidence that we are living in a time where there's more conspiracy theory belief than, say, there was 15 years ago. And there's also interesting research from the Rand Institute that actually goes back several centuries and has found that there's this phenomenon called truth decay, which means that there's a blurring between fact and opinion and mistrust of informational sources, and that often follows the development or innovations in new media, so that happened after the printing press and newspapers, that happened after TV and radio, and indeed seems to be happening in the internet era. So it's not true that, this point in time, sometimes it's claimed that we live in the golden age of conspiracy theories, as if this is unprecedented. And that's not fair to say. But as you noted in my book, I do make the claim that maybe it's more fair to say that we live in a dark age of conspiracy theories because the content of this conspiracy theories that are out there are more consequential. You could argue that believing that Princess Diana didn't just die in a random car accident, but was assassinated, that's a conspiracy theory, but what consequence does that have in my life or anyone's life? But a belief in something like the election was stolen, that had very significant consequences, right? That we saw in the US Capitol, where people stormed the Capitol. So I think that some of the conspiracy theory beliefs that are out there are more impactful. They have a greater potential to cause harm. And I would argue that part of the reason they are that there's more of them out there is because politicians currently are using them as a deliberate political strategy.
Yeah, that was going to be another question I had is that you write about people in groups that gain wealth or political power through the deliberate spread of misinformation. How does that happen?
Yeah, well, I think this is easy for any of us to imagine, because we're all on the internet. And unfortunately, the plain old boring truth is just that. It's plain and boring. And so, we might not click on a news article that just says something mundane but true. What we do click on and what people who are trying to make money off the internet, which is like everyone who's on the internet, are trying to do is capture our attention, right? Because we don't really subscribe to newspapers anymore. We don't pay subscription fees to most of what we see online. So we're all then these companies that are trying to put information out there are all competing for our eyeballs. So if I wanted to if I wanted to attract attention, it would then behoove me to say the most outrageous, salacious, and false thing I could possibly do. And that's a good way to capture attention. So that's part of it, is that false ideas, whether they're conspiracy theories or, just other ridiculous things like, I remember seeing a newspaper headline that said, Hillary Clinton is a robot, or something like that, or, Elvis has come back from the dead. I mean, there's something just really titillating about that makes us want to click. I'm guilty of that myself. So that's part of it, is that's such a good vehicle to attract attention that that's a good way to kind of piggyback other forms of information. And in this day and age, especially, we see this all the time in headlines, right? How often do you see a newspaper headline that has this sort of like really, headline that makes us really, really interested? And then we click on the article and we go, well, this article actually doesn't really answer the question that's posed in the headline or doesn't really say
Clickbait.
anything substantial.
Isn't
So yeah,
that
it's really
clickbait?
just all about getting our attention.
Yeah. And what makes an individual person more susceptible to belief in conspiracy theories? Are there personality traits or particular political affiliations that make somebody more prone to these beliefs?
Yeah, that's really a million-dollar question, and something that psychology researchers in particular have been looking at for at least the past decade. I mean, researching conspiracy theories is a relatively new direction, but there has in fact been quite a bit of research in conspiracy theories for some time now. And so that research has yielded what I often refer to as a laundry list, a long list of different, whether it's personality traits or cognitive biases, or sometimes I just call them psychological quirks that are associated with belief in conspiracy theory. Now, to be clear, these are not psychological traits that are unique to people that believe conspiracy theories. They just happen to be overrepresented. So we're back to this idea of quantifying it, So somebody who's more likely to believe in conspiracy theories would be more likely to have a specific psychological trait. And before I tell you what some of those psychological traits are, I want to say that I think we often make the mistake of thinking of the conspiracy theory believer as the person wearing a tinfoil hat and they're downstairs in their basement and that kind of thing. But polls have consistently shown that the majority of the population, whether it's in the US or other parts of the world, believe in at least one conspiracy theory. One of the latest polls that looked at this internationally found that in the US, something like 70% of poll respondents believe in conspiracy theories. So it's, I think, important to get away from the idea of like, well, I'm a rational person who doesn't believe anything so outlandish, and there's other people. But if you do look at psychological traits that are associated with a greater propensity for conspiracy theory belief, those include a lot of different things. One is a need for uniqueness. This is the idea that you kind of get off on the idea that I've stumbled on the real truth and all the rest of you sheeple, you know, don't see the real truth. And there's something very gratifying about that. There's also psychological needs that I refer to sometimes as the three C's. So that would be control, I'm blanking on the three C's. Control, certainty, and closure, right? The idea that this sort of provides this tidy narrative. That's thought to be one of the things that's appealing about conspiracy theory beliefs, rather than just thinking that things happen randomly and we therefore lack control, like Princess Diana dying. If there's a conspiracy theory, maybe that actually makes us feel like, even though it's this malevolent thing, we still have a way to control it, right? We can identify who the evil people are responsible and therefore, address them. And there's all sorts of other psychological traits that are associated with conspiracy theory belief, something called intuitive thinking as opposed to analytical thinking, which is a kind of tendency that you actually see in delusional people sometimes. It's a sort of jump to conclusions. I go with my gut and I make an immediate decision about I'm going to believe this rather than slowing down and thinking through. There's also something I devote an entire chapter to in my book, very provocatively called bullshit receptivity, this sort of a greater propensity to be attracted to information that might seem profound on the surface, but is actually not meaningful or not true. So those are some examples of these long lists of different things that are associated with conspiracy theory belief. And to be clear, that doesn't mean that if you believe in conspiracy theories, you're going to have that whole laundry list. I think there's a number of different reasons why we as individuals might believe in conspiracy theories. And one thing I tried to argue in the book is that I often talk about this more universal framework, a framework that maybe you could apply to everyone. That doesn't mean that those psychological traits aren't relevant, but I think this is a more easy way to explain it. And so sometimes I refer to this as a 3M model based on 3Ms, which are in the subtitle of my book. So mistrust, misinformation, subtitle actually says disinformation, but misinformation and motivated reasoning. And just really briefly, what that means is number one, mistrusting traditional or mainstream sources of information, right? That's the idea of just asking questions. Then once we turn away from those sources because we don't trust them, then we become vulnerable to misinformation that's out there in the world. That's sort of looking for answers, right? And I stumble upon counter narratives that are appealing to me. And then motivated reasoning. You asked about politics. Well, motivated reasoning is a kind of rational thought process we engage in when we encounter information, and often based on our ideological affiliations, like, for example, our political identity. We might be more likely to say, well, no, I don't believe this information, but I do believe that one, right? So a conservative would be most likely to say Fox News is reliable and CNN isn't, or a liberal would think the opposite. And so I think those three components can really help us understand the phenomenon of false belief in a way that's more humanizing and less prone to pathologizing people.
Yeah, and speaking of that, most of us now interact with people or have loved ones who have delusional beliefs of some sort or delusion-like beliefs. And I wanted to ask about that because you wrote in your book that people ask you about communicating with their loved ones who have conspiracy beliefs. And I often get asked, and I'm sure you do as well, about how to communicate with loved ones who have schizophrenia and have delusional beliefs because of schizophrenia. And I thought it might be interesting to kind of talk a little bit about how to communicate with people who have these beliefs when you don't share them, because I don't think it's necessarily intuitive, and families often don't really know what to do or how to talk to people. So I thought I would discuss kind of some tips that I have on talking to people with delusions related to schizophrenia, and then maybe you can talk a bit about talking to somebody who has conspiracy theory beliefs. Um, when I talk to my patients with schizophrenia and they express delusional beliefs, one of the first things I ask them, and you mentioned this as well, is to ask about a conviction scale. So to ask, how convinced are you that your belief is true? Because some people are 100% absolutely convinced that their belief is factual. Other people are convinced, but there's a part of them that thinks that maybe they could be wrong. And usually people can give me a percentage. They can say, well, I'm 80% convinced, but 20% of me thinks maybe I'm wrong. And that kind of helps me understand how firmly the person holds the belief. And a main principle that I always tell people to keep in mind when talking to a loved one with a delusional belief is that the purpose of the discussion is not to prove them wrong or to come up with evidence that what they believe is incorrect. The purpose of the discussion is to introduce the idea that there may be other explanations for what they're experiencing. And I do this all the time with my patients. So if I have a patient who sees a helicopter outside their window at night, and their first thought, their primary belief is that the police are monitoring them, and that's why the helicopter is there. I might say, okay, that's one explanation, but what's another explanation? Could you think of any other reason that that helicopter might be there? And I would say, I don't know if this is true in your experience as well, Joe, but mostly people cannot come up with another explanation because they're so tuned into the persecutory part of it that they can't even think of another explanation. And in those cases, I'll tell them like one or two alternatives that I thought of, like maybe a crime was committed in their neighborhood and that's why the helicopter is there, or maybe there's a hospital nearby and they're taking an injured patient to the hospital or whatever. So I'm going to introduce alternative thoughts and other explanations that are less personal and less negative in content. Um, and the point of that conversation is not to get the person to agree with me. It's to get them to start thinking about other more benign explanations for the things that they're experiencing. And if you practice this enough with somebody, they may start to come up with alternative explanations on their own. And the last thing that I wanted to mention about this is that it's really important to remember that these beliefs are very distressing to people. So if somebody believes that they are personally being monitored by the FBI, even if I know that the belief is false, I have to keep in mind that it's very real and very scary to the person who has the belief. And so you can validate their emotions without agreeing that what they're telling you is true. So, for example, instead of saying, don't worry, there's no way that the FBI is interested in you. You haven't done anything in your life that warrants the FBI to be following you. You can say it must be really terrifying to feel that you're being followed all the time. So that's a statement that allows the person to feel like they're understood, and hopefully that they can open up to you more about their experiences without actually saying that you agree with them. I was wondering if you had any advice for people who are worried about their loved ones who may be experiencing conspiracy beliefs, which are different.
Yeah, and of course, you and I were trained similarly, so I use a very similar approach when I'm dealing with patients who are struggling with delusions, who are mentally ill. I think those of us who have some experience in psychotherapy can apply some of those techniques outside of the mentally ill population. I will say, though, that there's at least two substantial differences when we're working with clinical patients and when we're talking about, Uncle Freddie who shows up at the Thanksgiving, dinner. So one of them is that when we're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what you're describing, there's usually not too much of a dispute on evidence and what constitutes evidence. As I mentioned, there's subjective inner experience. So that's one type of evidence that might be conflictual. But for example, when we're doing CBT with a depressed patient, and a depressed patient feels like I'm a terrible person, my boss hates me, I'm probably going to get fired, we might go through those cognitive distortions, get people to gather evidence, bring it back into session, and say, well, did the evidence support this belief? And that's where we start to say, okay, well, do we still believe that 90% or this week is it 80%? So, as I said earlier, when we're talking about delusion-like beliefs, and particularly the kind that I'm interested in, the evidence is less subjective experience and more, I read this somewhere, or I
Mhm.
saw, somebody on TV or on YouTube telling me this. So that then becomes challenging from a CBT standpoint because we might be talking about two fundamentally different sources of information. They're not just saying, I believe this because I feel it's true. They're saying, look, like, here's the evidence. And you say, well, wait, look at my evidence. And they say, well, I don't believe that, right? That's fake news.
Mm.
So I think that's challenging. So I think if you do find yourself in a situation where you're talking to somebody like that, like you said, you can't just jump in and say, okay, well, I want to change this person's mind. I'm going to argue about my sources better than yours. any psychotherapy starts with establishing trust, developing a therapeutic relationship, having rapport with someone. So I think the same is true when we approach people who are not mentally ill, who have these kinds of false beliefs, whether it's conspiracy theories or otherwise. So when people ask me things like, how do I talk to Uncle Freddie? The first thing I say is, well, what's your goal in talking with Uncle Freddie? Because if your goal is to change his mind,
Mm,
that's not going to work, right?
yeah.
You got to start, whether it's a patient or not a patient, with empathic listening, really understanding, really listening with an intent to understand the person. And when you have that, then maybe you can start challenging things and getting into things like, well, why do you believe this? What's your source of information? Oh, isn't that interesting that you rely on this? I rely on this other source of information. And then you can start doing the work that you're talking about sort of gently challenging beliefs and presenting alternative hypotheses. It is also tricky because people who believe in conspiracy theories often want to kind of grab you and bring you down the rabbit hole with them, right? It's like, I want to show you the truth. And sometimes, if you really go down the rabbit hole, you get a sense of just how much misinformation is out there. But I think there are certain parallels. I would also just comment that, there are many other different types of psychotherapy besides CBT. So you could, for example, approach this from a dynamic standpoint. And I was talking about different psychological needs that people have that might underlie conspiracy theory beliefs or other false beliefs. So if my belief in conspiracy theories is rooted in this need for uniqueness, I can't we can't expect that we're going to convince somebody that they're wrong and just take that away, right? Take the need for uniqueness away along with their belief, or
Mhm.
take the need for control and closure. So I think for you and me who do clinical work, it's kind of similar to having a grandiose delusion, right? If I believe I'm not mentally ill, I'm a millionaire and I own 20 properties and I can leave the hospital and go stay there, taking that kind of belief away from someone can actually be pretty crushing.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about modifying beliefs, we have to think about what psychological need is it fulfilling and how can I then replace that need? So if it is a family member, and we're not talking about a therapist, then I think the most important thing is just to show that person you care, that you're willing to listen, you want to be in their lives, because some of what happens when people go down the proverbial rabbit hole is that's where they're getting the source of social connection, the source of specialness, the source of meaning. And so we kind of, if we want to bring someone back out of that, we want to replace those needs with something more healthy.
Mm. I know we're out of time for this portion, but I'm also thinking, I wonder how much of, conspiracy theory thinking is also kind of fear-based, or fear of what, being afraid that things will be taken away, so it may be motivated by that kind of thing as well.
Yeah. Well, back to the earlier question about are conspiracy theory beliefs more prevalent now? It is known that conspiracy theory beliefs tend to uh, be prominent during times of crisis and times of uncertainty.
Mhm.
And I mentioned that my interest started off with flat Earth beliefs. Well, then suddenly we hit the pandemic, and then we hit QAnon and all the different things that had happened with politics. And anecdotally, during that time, people started staying at home, right, during lockdowns, and they're getting on these computers. So when I was first interested in conspiracy theories, I had no idea it would suddenly become this relevant. Uh,
Yeah,
so I think the crisis that was both the pandemic and some of the other world events really fueled that.
accelerated it. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. I know this could have gone on and on. It was a fascinating discussion. And Joe, I want to thank you for writing this book. I know you started to write it several years ago, but it could not be more relevant today. And really thank you for trying to help us understand how misinformation happens on, especially electronically on the internet, and disinformation and some of the motivations behind it psychologically. And Alaina, thank you so much for giving us the privilege of learning from you and letting us know a little bit about the clinic that you run, which I think is so important for everybody to know about. So now we have a lot of questions. I know we're not supposed to be political, but a lot of these questions are political. So I'm just going to preface it with that, and I will try to be as neutral asking them as I can. So here's one question. Polls tell us that Americans are more politically polarized today and that we only tend to believe what we hear from our political party. And I'm going to extend that to what Joe mentioned, MSNBC versus Fox News. To what extent do you see shareability as playing a part in this? It's for both of you. So,
Well, I'm not totally sure what we mean by shareability in that, but I certainly agree that informational sources are very key, and that the political division over beliefs and beliefs that are false. You know, just gave a lecture last night where I talked a lot about vaccine-related beliefs or
we have
climate
a
change
question
beliefs.
about vaccine
I
and
mean,
dairy.
those are very, in this current moment, are very predictable based on political affiliation. And so I think it's indisputable that much of what we believe is based on those ideological affiliations. And today, a lot of them are based on political affiliations. And that's largely because people who follow politics are listening to political leaders or the preferred news source that are telling us these things. You know, the guy who was responsible for Pizzagate. He actually recently passed away. Um, but that he was not a delusional. I didn't examine him, so I'm careful with my clinical comments. But I don't think that he was a delusional person. He talked about how he had read this thing or he had heard it on the radio, and there were several different conservative talk shows at the time that were talking about Hillary Clinton is running this child pornography ring in the basement of the pizzeria. And he said, well, that sounds really important. I better investigate that. So I think this issue of misinformation is really, really important. And unfortunately is related to politics and is sort of being weaponized as a political strategy.
Yes, definitely being weaponized. And we see it played out before our eyes, such as the insurrection. And then you have people that saw it, but they didn't see it. They don't believe it. How do you explain that? That they saw something concrete on a screen and yet they don't believe it's real.
Yeah.
How does the brain do that?
Well, you know, I don't want to give, I think politics is really important. I have an entire chapter in the book that's devoted to politics. So I think that's really important in this subject matter. But what I don't want to give the impression is that this issue of false belief is only something that happens with our ideological opposites. You know, liberals and Democrats, they believe conspiracy theories, they have false beliefs. In fact, after the most recent election, it was very interesting, right? Because the Republicans for the past 4 years had been saying that the previous election had been stolen, right? That's what led to the insurrection at the Capitol. And then after Trump won, suddenly we haven't heard a peep from Republicans about elections being rigged. But on the Democratic side, actually, now we're hearing more. I mean, maybe it's not to the same degree, but we are hearing more conspiracy theorizing about the election being stolen, and that's why Donald Trump won, right? There's an idea that Elon Musk somehow used Starlink to manipulate voting machines. So I don't like to frame it as this is something that only Republicans or conservatives or, whoever does. We all have this vulnerability. It just happens to be, for a variety of reasons, that there is an asymmetry now. And I think, as I said, again, a lot of it has to do with informational sources and what media that's politically affiliated is telling people. So I don't know if the question had to do shareability, like could we actually have a shared sense of reality? Well, I don't know, but it would be nice if we, across the political fence could say, you know what, that one source of information, like we can all kind of trust it. There used to be a PBS show called like
Yes,
Left, Right, and Center, right? I understand
right.
that's no longer on the air, but
It's
I
on
think,
NPR.
oh, it is still. Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So, I think something like that is really important, but you do have to be careful about the both sidesism issue, right? Sometimes you get sucked into a debate, and do we really want to have a quote unquote debate about creationism and evolution? Well, that might be less productive. So I think we have to be careful when we do those sort of, looking at two sides of the argument discussions.
Thank you. Alaina, did you want to add anything?
No.
No, you're good. Okay. I have a question here about how can you rebuild a relationship with a person who believes in conspiracy theories and took offense on you trying to make them see the other side, which you talked about not doing that, but once you've done it, then how do you repair that?
Well, I mean, what comes to mind is the same way you repair any relationship that's had a rift for any reason. I'm kind of thinking of a specific example of a friend who like stopped talking to me for months at a time. And it took me some time to, talk to that person and figure out what it was. And then I realized that it was indeed something I had said, over dinner months ago. So I mean, the first step is to apologize, right? Now, the apology doesn't have to be you were right and I was wrong, right? But the apology can be, hey, I'm sorry that we got into an argument. I'm sorry, about what I said and that was hurtful to you. And hey, do you want to go grab a beer or do you want to go to a yoga class, whatever, and sort of rebuild it. And like I was saying about, if you're ever hoping to challenge somebody's beliefs or get them to change their minds about something, it really has to start with it being a healthy relationship. So I think that's one way that you can do it. And during the height of QAnon, when I was getting a lot of media interviews asking me, what do I do with my family member about QAnon? What I would often say is something like that, like, go have lunch and don't talk about QAnon. In fact, have an agreement and say, hey, let's not talk about that today because, we got in an argument last time, but let's talk about the Lakers or, whatever. So I think that's one way to kind of get your foot back in the door.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. I think we are living in a time when it's really easy to live in a reality that doesn't exist in a material way. Meaning a lot of us live a lot of our lives online, and we don't, that world it exists in some way, but it doesn't exist in a kind of material way. And I think for me, it's been helpful to kind of really focus on the material world and on my communities that impact me directly in my life. And I think when I have family members who have conspiracy beliefs, or who have really different political beliefs, it's helpful to me to really keep the focus on our relationship, and not have the focus be on other things. And a lot of times that means that we just can't talk about those things, because there isn't going to be a common ground. We're not going to agree on this. I've already tried, and I think it is, it is, you have to kind of, for me, I have to accept that my relationship is going to be limited, but I'm also going to focus on the positives and the strengths in this person and our shared interests and the things that are here. And maybe we just don't talk about those other things.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, I mean, I think that's a great comment, Elena. But I am a proponent, and I talk about this in the book, of face-to-face interaction. Maybe this argument, this, sort of hypothetical argument you're talking about between two people, for all we know, that occurred over a text message. And
Mhm.
so the way to rebuild that relationship isn't to text message back, it's to get in front of people, whether it's our loved ones who we had a rift with, or even our political opposites. It's very easy when you're online, especially on places like social media, to get sucked into conflict.
Mhm.
You could even argue, kind of conspiratorially, that that's intentionally what algorithms are trying to do. And I don't even want to say that's a conspiracy. There is definitely evidence that that is partly what the algorithms incentivize, right? Because that makes you want to get in there and like, I've got to respond to this thing because it's got me so upset. So that's, I think, a terrible way to interact with the real people in our lives. So that's why I say, let's go get a beer, let's go to yoga class, or let's take a walk in the park. I think that's way, way more likely to improve things than, sending an email or something of that nature.
Thank you. Good advice. Joe, three M's: mistrust, motivated reasoning, and
Misinformation. The
mis-
editors of the book didn't like alliteration, so they made me change misinformation to disinformation. But three M's for me is easier to remember.
Thank you. Um, Question here. What about some current truths that at one time were considered conspiracy theories or false beliefs? due to a lack of information. How do you push back against the idea that once more information is available, a conspiracy theory may be proven correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's the fun thing about conspiracy theories, right? The so-called conspiracy theorists often tell us that real conspiracies have happened. MK Ultra, that was a real thing. COINTELPRO, back in the 1960s. So one of the things I try to make a point of in my book is to talk about a kind of, for want of a better word, scientific thinking, right? When we talk about medicine and, if Alaina and I are treating someone with schizophrenia and like what's the best treatment, available, that information is going to change. Now, oftentimes people are frustrated with medicine because this year it's like aspirin every day is good for you. And then 5 years later, they're like, nope, don't take aspirin anymore. And I think some of the mistrust of science and scientists stems from that. But as I say in the book, that's really the superpower of science. The superpower of science is the belief, what constitutes a fact, does change according to the evidence. Unfortunately, that's not how human beings think, right? We're not scientists who are constantly gathering information and saying, oh, well, I'm going to modify our belief. We tend to dig our heels in and we tend to say, this is what I believe. And if I give ground, then I'm weak, or somehow that erodes my identity. So I think that's really important, is to be what I call cognitively flexible. So to answer more directly the question about conspiracy theories, yeah, like look at something like the lab leak hypothesis. I think the last time the idea that COVID-19 was caused by a man-made virus, or man-made or not, that got released from the lab in Wuhan, China, and that's why the pandemic occurred. I mean, to be very clear, it's possible that that happened, but the evidence right now doesn't support it. So for me, I tend to say, well, look, again, it's possible, but I don't think that's where my belief is right now. In fact, there is counter evidence that supports that it, occurred naturally in nature. But I think that ability to shift when the evidence changes, like that's good. We should be doing that. And what we want to avoid is the idea like, no, I think this is true because it feels right to me, right? That's the intuitive thinking. Or Stephen Colbert talked about truthiness, right? This idea that we decide what's true because of how it makes us feel. And I think that's a really dangerous thing that we want to avoid.
And I wanted to add one thing to that, which is that when my patients bring up beliefs to me that I'm pretty sure are not true, whether they're conspiracy theories or any other belief, I'm never 100% sure, and I always tell them, it's possible, there is a world in which the FBI is following you. I don't think it's true, but I do think we need to remain humble and realize that, yeah, it is possible that these things are true. And so you have to have, as Joe said, flexibility, and you also have to have humility, and how there are very few things that we can be very certain about, and we really have to have that flexibility when we talk to everybody in our lives.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a wonderful short story. It's called The Jet Propelled Couch, written by an analyst, I think back in the 50s. And it talks about that very thing, about how a therapist actually kind of gets sucked into the delusional world with the patient. I think it got made into a Kevin Spacey movie some years ago. I forgot what it was called, but it's a good read, and it talks about that phenomenon.
Wow. One thing I can be certain about is that this was a fascinating discussion, and that the two of you imparted some very valuable information for all of us to take in and consider. So thank you, Joe and Alaina, for the privilege of listening to your conversation and sharing your expertise with us. And I also want to thank everybody that tuned in for the privilege of your time. We have another open mind on Wednesday, March 19th, with Dr. Drew Ramsey, who will be talking about his new book, Healing the Modern Brain. And he'll be in discussion with Dr. Arpana Church, who is Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Goodman Luskin Microbiome Center. So again, thank you to everyone. Stay safe, stay well, be kind, and have a lovely evening. Night.
Thank you.